Senator from Vermont. May we have order? The chamber, please.
Mr. President, the driving force behind the fight against climate change has been young people here in the United States and abroad. They have marched, they have demonstrated, they have demanded institutional disinvestment in fossil fuel companies. In short, they have fought for a world in which they and their kids and grandchildren could live in a healthy and habitable planet. This legislation invests some $300 billion in energy efficiency and sustainable energy, and that's a good thing. But it invests very little in giving our younger generation the opportunities to roll up their sleeves and get to work in moving our energy system away from the fossil fuel which is destroying our planet. This amendment invests $30 billion in a civilian conservation corps, which would create 400,000 jobs for young people. They will be paid a living wage, given benefits toward higher education, and be trained for good union clean energy jobs. Let us stand with the young people who have led the fight against climate change. I urge a yes vote for the Civilian Conservation Corps.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina.
Thank you very much. I would urge no. This has been tried before by my colleague, Senator Sanders. This would give hundreds of thousands of people enlisting free housing, free food, transportation, educational cost. We have a weak economy. Every time I rise to speak, we're growing the government in a different way. If you really want to help the American people secure their border, if you want to hire anybody new, hire a Border Patrol agent, not 87,000 IRS agents, not a climate corps. I know these are well-intentioned, but we're living in a very tenuous time for the American people, and their needs are not being met tonight. Every problem they have is being made worse. We don't need a climate corps right now. Quite frankly, we need to secure a broken border before terrorists come across and kill a bunch of us. Vote no.
The question is on the amendment. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be sufficient second. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Mr. Sanders voted in the affirmative. 'Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Bozeman, Braun, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Duckworth, Durbin, Ernst, Fisher, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Haggerty, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Heidsmith, Inhofe, Keene, Kelly, Kennedy, King, Leahy, Lujan, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Ossoff, Padilla, Paul, Peters, Portman, Reed, Romney, Rosen, Rounds, Sass, Schatz, Schumer, Scott of Florida, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Sullivan, Tester, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Tuberville, Van Hollen, Warnock, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, no. Mr. Rubio, no. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Manchin, no. Mr. Lee, no. Mr. Rono, no. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Marshall, no. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Hawley, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mr. Young, no. Mr. Barrasso, no. Ms. Lummis, no. Mr. Risch, no. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. McConnell, no.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or wishing to change their votes? If not, the yeas are 1, the nays are 98, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. President.
Senator from West Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I call up my amendment